Alright, good morning everybody, and welcome to another ePrime live stream. My name is Devon Struthers. I'm the training coordinator for Psychology Software Tools, and today we'll be talking about one of our samples that comes installed with ePrime 3. So the sample is called Basic Button RT that we're going to be talking about today. And like I said, this gets installed with every installation of ePrime 3. If you have ePrime 3 installed on your computer, you can find it by just opening up any Windows Explorer here, going to Documents, My Experiments 3.0, go ahead and click on Samples, and the finished version of what we'll be doing today is going to be called Basic Button RT. It is the very first one. It is a modification of what we call Basic RT. A Basic RT is just a simple lexical decision task. You're presented with a couple of words and you have to pick out the oddball. With Basic Button RT, what we'll be doing is showing a series of words and non-words, and participants are going to identify them either with a click of a yes button or a click of a no button. So is this a word? Yes. Is it not a word? Or is it a word? No. No button. This program, one of the fun features about it, being a basic button RT experiment, is entirely touchscreen enabled. I don't have a touchscreen on this computer, so me poking at the computer screen won't do much. But if you have a Microsoft Surface tablet, if you have any other kinds of tablets that you're running, or even a touchscreen laptop that you're running this program on, it is fully touchscreen enabled. So we're going to be taking a lot of steps to kind of make it touchscreen enabled today too. So it'll be a pretty cool experiment to demonstrate, albeit a little bit simple. But today we're kind of focusing just on touchscreen compatibility and specifically a lot of the different uses and the different properties of the button device itself. So before we go ahead and begin the webinar, I do want to mention that we have a new and improved website. Take a look. It's pretty nice. We have all of our products now situated into different research categories. So if you're doing behavioral research, what do we have to offer? fMRI research, MRI simulation. Connect to ePrime. This is a list of all of our extensions products that we currently have. And if you see a couple on here that I haven't really done a live stream on yet and you're curious, let me know. I'd be happy to do a live stream on any one of these. Alright, so let's go ahead and dive in. So like I said, the experiment that we're making today is just going to be a very basic lexical decision task. Participants are going to be asked to choose between whether the stimuli presented is a word or a non-word. And if it's a word, I want them to click a yes button on the screen. If it's a non-word, I want them to click a no button on the screen. Like every good experiment, we're going to go ahead and start with a welcome screen. Just, hey, welcome to the experiment. Go ahead and push the start button to start. So what we're going to do is in ePrime 3.0, I have a blank experiment window here. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to double click on session proc. Again, this is my procedural timeline. This is the start of my experiment. This is the end of my experiment over here. And the first thing I want to add is a welcome slide. Just welcome to the experiment. So I'm going to take a slide object from my toolbox and I'm going to drag it and drop it as the first object in my experimental timeline here. That ensures that it's the first thing that appears when participants run the experiment. So I'm going to rename this one from slide 1, click on this rename button, I'm just going to call it welcome. Again, I like the name to reflect the function. It's not entirely necessary on this, but it's always nice just for data logging and for keeping track of everything later. So if I double click on the welcome slide object here, it's going to open itself up in the workspace. Keep in mind, if you're new to ePrime, this is the first live stream you're watching, or if this is the first time designing an experiment, we try to reflect how the screen is going to look in these slide objects whenever they run. So keep in mind that these dots here in the background, this grid pattern, it's strictly for reference. You don't see these at all when you run the experiment. In fact, if you want to turn them off, you can click on this toggle grid button here in the upper right-hand corner, and now it's going to look exactly how it looks whenever you run the experiment. I personally like the grid because it allows me to line up my e-objects, but it's entirely up to you. So the first thing I want to add is a text display object. I just want some very simple text at the beginning of the experiment that just says, hey, welcome. So I'm going to click on it, and I'm going to enlarge it just a little bit here. There we go. Make it the exact size I want. And let's change some text here. So just welcome to the experiment. Press the start button to begin. There we go. Now I have it at the very top of the experiment, or at the very top of the window here. If I want, I can lower it just a little bit. But that's really all I need to change as far as the text is concerned. If I want to change the size, because it is a little small considering it's the only thing on the screen, I'm going to click on it once and then click on this Slide Sub-Object Properties page. And I know that I'm going to get this sub-object properties, or the properties page for this particular slide text sub-object, because if I look in this window over here, it says text1, and that's the name of this object. We're going to be working a lot with the names of objects as well today, so we're going to get into a pretty good habit today of identifying what the names of each of our objects are before we start editing their properties. I can tell that this is text1, so I click on the background here. My background's called state1. If I click on this, you see it change to text1. And in my properties window over here, you also see name, and that's set to text1. So that's exactly what we're going to need. So I'm going to click on this properties page here and go over to the font, and I'm going to change the font size to something a little bigger. We'll say 25. And as you can see, it's a little bigger. That looks perfect. I like the way that looks. So now I need to add a start button to continue. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to click on slide button here. I'm going to put slide button down there, and I want to make it a little bigger, a little more oblong maybe. There we go. So if you look here, the name is called button 1, but I want to call it a start button just because they're going to be pressing on the start button to start. So I'm going to rename this one over here in the properties page. Now keep in mind you can also rename it by going into its properties page right here, but I kind of like that properties pane. So I'm going to rename this from button 1 to start button. Now if you notice, nothing about the button itself actually changed, only the name in the background did. So whenever I press anything in E' or make a response to this button, I know that start button is going to be what I'm responding to. So now if I click on the properties page button right here, or properties page for my start button, you'll see that my name changed from button 1 to start button. Response, I'm not actually going to be changing that right now, because right now if I keep this blank, it's going to show up as a response in my data file just as start button, and that's perfect for me, honestly. So I don't really need to change that. I will be changing that later, and I'll show you exactly how that affects the data afterwards. Auto check, no. Initial check, no. It doesn't make any sense to do this on a button object. Frame, I'm going to keep it the same because I like the way it looks on my slide right now. If I go like that. And theme. Now this is where you can start making some pretty fancy, pretty cool buttons. If you want, I can make this image, or I can make this button just a clickable image, and it says start, and let's say I made it in, you know, Photoshop or something, and it looks really slick, and I want to add it to my experiment. I can do that. Otherwise, we have some images already preloaded. If you click on this open button, it'll take you just to my experiments 3.0 here, but there are a couple of preloaded images that we have that will allow you to like change the background color, change like here. If I go to its at resources folder, so if I click on this button, it'll take you to the resources folder on your system, and then it'll show you, hey, these are the different options that we have. So if you ever want like a good idea of, you know, hey, these are the options that we have for buttons, I want to change the background to magenta for some reason, then that's definitely possible. So you can change the image, you can change what the icon of it looks like, and you can also change the text. That's what I'm most interested in today, though, it's just that text. And right now it just says button, it's not descriptive, so, and I want it to be an actual start button. So I'm going to change the text to start, and when I make that change, you'll notice that my text is now bold. The reason that it's bold is because it's letting me know this is different from what was here by default. So by default, it was just called button, and if I click apply, you'll see that my button here changed to the word start. And I'm going to also change the size here to be consistent with the size of my text. There we go, so it's a slightly bigger start button. And there we go. So now this is looking a little better. I like the way this looks. Yeah. So all of these defaults, you'll see if I change, or all of these properties here, you'll see if I change them from their default. So button, it doesn't say button, it doesn't say 18 anymore, it says start, and the size is 25. You'll see that they're bold, and that's just so you can very quickly and easily identify what's going on with that button. Now, let's say I wanted to do something different when I click on it. I would have to change the circumstance. So right now the circumstance that I'm on, and this is pretty important, the circumstance that I'm on for this button is just called normal. So normal is just when the button's kind of chilling out on the slide, when nothing's really happening to it, and it's just in its, you know, normal state. I can also click down here and I can change whatever I want. So what happens whenever I hover over the button? Do I want the text to change? I'll change it to hover, for example. Now if you look, nothing's really changed on the button object, but give me a second here. I'm going to save this very quickly just to my desktop. Let's do button RT. There we go. We'll run this in windowed mode quickly, just to show you the functionality of that button. I still have my start button. Oh, I didn't change the duration input properties, so it exited off of the screen pretty quickly. So we'll go in duration input here. We'll change the duration to infinite. So what this allows us to do is it allows us to stay on the screen for as long as possible. Data logging I will set to standard. And I'm going to add a button input mask. Now the reason I'm using a button input mask and not a mouse input mask, even though I'm very clearly using a mouse to respond to this, is because this is also a touchscreen enabled experiment. So the responses that I'm making aren't necessarily going to come from whether I press 1 or 2 on the mouse here. It's actually going to come from what's going to happen to the button itself. And if you notice, whenever you add a button, it has this default allowable of a little asterisk there. What that asterisk there is or a wildcard symbol. What that is there is it just basically says any click to any button is what I want. And since I only have one button here, all I need is that start button, and that's going to be exactly, whoops, sorry about that. That's going to be exactly what I need. So I'm going to keep that right there. There we go. Alright, so I'm going to keep that exactly the way it is there. I'm going to click apply and OK. It takes a second to apply. If it does that, just know that it's going into this logging tab, and it's just checking all of these data logging properties here. Here we go. So we're going to try to run it one more time with those properties changed. There we go. Welcome to the experiment. Press start button to begin. And if I hover over it, you'll see that the text now changes to hover. And just it changing to hover doesn't necessarily mean that anything different is happening. I'm not making a response, it just knows that my mouse is hovering over the button now. So, I mean, this is a little more helpful if you're using a mouse like I am. If this is a fully touchscreen enabled, you're never really going to see that hover, but if I click on it, then it ends. And that means that input mask that I had set up here, this button input mask with my allowable set to any button press, is working exactly correctly. And if I want to, I can even go ahead and take a look at my data file here, just to see how a button's being logged in ePrime. And if you'll see here, the response to that welcome screen that I have is just start button in little curly brackets. And all that means is that I pressed on that start button. And if you notice, the dot response is just set to the same thing as the name of the button itself, not any special value. And like I said, we're going to be changing that a little later though, so hold tight for that. Alright, so now that I have my welcome screen made, I'm going to make a screen for instructions, just so participants know what they're actually doing in this task. So I'm going to take another slide object and put it just after my welcome slide, and I'm going to rename this one to instructions. And I'm going to double click on it to open it in the workspace. Now the formatting is going to be pretty similar to what my welcome screen was. It's going to be text with a button underneath, but the text is going to be a little more verbose than just welcome to the experiment, press start to continue. So, in this task, you will be shown a fixation followed by a stimuli. If the stimuli is a word, press yes. If the stimuli is a non-word, press no. Click continue to begin. There we go. I want to make my font a little bit bigger. I want to make it that same 25 size font. So I'm just going to click on this properties page icon here, hop over to font, and change size to 25. Whoops. There we go. It looks a little better, a little bigger. You notice my first letter of the first word there's a little cut off, so we'll just resize this. It's starting to look a little better. There we go. And if I double click on it, it's going to show me exactly what it's going to look like at runtime too. Now I just want to do the exact same thing I did before. I want to add a button to my slide object. I want to make it a little bigger. Go into the properties page here. I'm going to rename it now to continue button. Click apply. I'm going to hop over to the theme tab. I'm going to keep it normal here. I'm not going to change any of the specific circumstances, but I do want to change the text from button to continue. and I'll change the font size to 25 to match my other text there. Let's go ahead and click Apply and OK, and there we go. That was really all I needed. Now the only thing I need to change is just that duration input tab again. So if I go into the properties page of the slide object here, click on duration input, I want duration to be infinite because I want participants to have enough time to read the instructions for the task. Data logging is going to be standard again. I'm going to click Apply just to make sure that data logging takes effect. And I'm going to click Add, and I'm going to add a button object here. Now again, this doesn't need to change at all. I'm going to keep this as, or my allowable just to the default since there's only one button on here. Obviously we're going to be adding more buttons to the next object, so it's going to look a little different. It's going to look a little more involved, but for now, I'm going to keep that right there. So I'm going to click Apply and OK, and this is looking good. I'm going to go ahead and run this very quickly in windowed mode just to make sure that it works. I do recommend doing this if you're ever running a lot of e-prime experiments or if you're making a rather big e-prime experiment. I do recommend running as frequently as possible just to make sure that every little component of your experiment is working how you want it to before you kind of blow it up into this big experiment with a lot of little issues. So right now I have my start button, works the way I want it to. All my font looks good there. I click on continue, that works as expected. Perfect. So now I have the first two objects working exactly the way I want. So I'm going to close all these windows just to kind of get a little bit more of a clear workspace here. I'm going to double click on this session proc. Now the next thing I want to do is I want to add a list object. This list object is called a block list, and in ePrime it's a very special type of thing that we're adding to the experiment just to add a new what we call level to the experiment. And I know I've shown this a couple times before, but if I go to my experiment object here and then go to data file, you'll see that right now I'm in something called the session proc, which is at the session level of my experiment. The next one down is called block. And if you notice this little L-shaped dotted line here, this means that it's in a new procedure in ePrime. So ePrime's expecting a procedure that has to do with a block. So we call it a block level procedure in ePrime, if you've ever heard that kind of jargon thrown around. So block level procedure, trial level procedure. All we mean is just one procedure below the session proc for block level, two below the session proc for the trial level. So that's what we mean in when we talk about these kinds of things in ePrime. So in order to make that block level procedure, which we're just going to call block proc, I'm going to take a list object and I'm going to put it just after my instructions here. And I'm going to rename this list just to block list, since the purpose of this list object is not to hold any sort of block level information. We can if we really want, but instead what it's going to be doing is it's just going to be creating our block procedure, or block level procedure, if you want to make it a little more generic. So all we do is double click on it to open it in the workspace here. And under procedure, what I'm going to do is just type the word block proc. Hit enter, it'll give you a little warning message. Block proc does not exist. Would you like to create it? Of course I would. And then it says, would you like to make it the default value for newly created levels, which means that every time I make a new level in this list object, it's going to autofill block proc as my procedure. I'm not going to make any new levels, so this really doesn't matter, so I'm going to click yes. Alright, so let's go ahead and double click on the block proc. Now the next thing I want to do is I want to add another list object that's going to house all of my independent variables for my experiment. So I said I'm going to show words to participants, and I want those words to vary, so I'm going to put them in a list object. Now, since this is a small experiment, you do have the option of having every single one of your pieces of data or every one of your stimuli that you're presenting on a different slide object. However, that's going to make the data file look a little messy and a little clumsy. 2 weeks ago I had done a webinar or a live stream on common ePrime errors and how to fix them. I definitely recommend checking that one out because it is quite good, but not to brag. But I do recommend checking it out. But one of the things I do address in there is the difference between an experiment with a lot of objects that are made in one procedure and an object that uses, or an experiment that uses a list object to kind of nest all of the independent variables and what that data file looks like. And just know that we do try to keep all of the independent variables in a list object, literally just to streamline the experiment, make it a little nicer and a little easier on your computer for it to compile and run, but most importantly to make that data file look good so you don't have to do any like, oh, this was this trial and this was this trial and all sorts of data cleaning at the end and data reconstruct, or data reconfiguring in order just to get what you need out of what you run. So I am going to make that list object just to avoid that. So to take a to do that, I took a list object from my eObjects toolbox there, and I just put it as the first object in my block proc. And if you remember that little data chart that I showed you, the next level down is my trial level, so I'm going to call this one trial list. There we go. I'm going to double click on this to open it in eStudio's workspace here. Now I'm going to fill in a procedure, just like the last one, set a block proc. This one's going to be called trial proc. It does not exist. I would like to create it. Would I like to make it the default value of newly created levels? Of course I would. So I'm going to hop back into it. Now, unlike the other one, the block proc or the block list that I had made, I actually want to start filling this in with independent variables. I want to fill it in specifically with the word or non-word that's going to be shown, so the general stimuli, and the correct response to each one of those. So I'm going to do something called creating an attribute in a list object. An attribute is a column in a list object that can be referenced by any object at any other point in the experiment. That's one of the nice things about E prime, sort of the power of E prime, if you will, is that you can set all of these independent variables beforehand, and E prime is just going to be able to access those at any level below it, and by below I mean literally underneath it in this Experiment Explorer object. At any level beneath it, E prime can then get that information and use it for whatever it needs. In this case, we're going to be using information in a column that we make on this list object. We're going to be using it to change the text that appears on a single slide object on a per trial basis. So we'll only be using one slide object, but we'll be changing what's on that slide constantly. And we can do that through these attributes. So I'm going to click on this Add Attribute button, and I'm just going to call this attribute Stimulus, just to maintain consistent naming with the sample. And I'm going to click Enter. So now I'm going to fill in the first stimulus that I want, and it's just going to be the word cat. And then I need to make one more, and this one's going to be called StimType, which is also going to kind of double as my correct answer. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to make these a response. So I need a sort of correct response for participants. And if you recall, the way that the data is going to look in E prime is it's going to look like the name of the button that the participant is pressing in curly brackets. So I want to start with curly brackets, and then I'm just going to go ahead and make up a name for my correct and incorrect answers. So right now, oops, sorry, I'm going to make up an actual one. So the stim type in this case is going to be word. So not only am I going to be able to sort based on this data later in my data analysis whenever I get to that point, which I will, but I'm also going to be able to use this word as my correct response. So what I'm going to do now is I'm actually going to make a second trial. So right now I have one trial, and once I make all of my E objects in my trial proc, they should run fine, but one trial just isn't enough. So I'm going to make one more by clicking Add Level there, and I'm going to make another stimulus, and that is going to be dog. This is, of course, going to be word again, and EPROM's going to try to autofill that for me, so I'm going to let it. And I'm going to add another level. And now we're going to go ahead and jump into our non-words. So this non-word I'm just taking from the sample, looks like jet. And this is going to be non-word. And I'm going to add one more non-word here. And then this one's also going to be non-word. There we go. So now I have all of my stimulus, or all my stimuli that I'm presenting, and their associated correct response / word type. So this stim type is really going to be pulling double duty, and I'll show you how it does that later. So right now it looks like participants are going to get, because of the sequential selection here, they're going to get cat, dog, and then my two non-words right in a row, and that's not ideal. To change this, I'm going to click on this properties page icon here, and you can see that you can actually change a lot of different properties about the list object. The first general tab that comes up is just asking you how you're loading items into this list object in the first place. My load method right now is set to embedded, which means that I've typed out what I want on my list object. But keep in mind, you can also keep all of the independent variables and all of the information on a list object in a tab-delimited.txt file right here, and you can tell E prime where to find it. Now, granted, I don't have one, so I don't want to do that, but I want to keep that as embedded. The most important tab for us right now is sequential selection, or is this selection tab. It allows us to change the order in which the exemplars on the list object are presented. The order right now is set to sequential, but I'm going to change it to random. I'm going to click apply. So now participants are going to randomly get cat, dog, and my two non-words instead of having the two words followed by the two non-words, which is a pretty recognizable pattern. The other thing I'm going to do is I'm going to change this reset exit tab. This isn't necessarily in the sample experiment, but I like to have more than 4 trials just because 4 is kind of small. So if I want all 4 trials to appear more than once, what I can do is I can change the number of cycles that this trial runs. And if I change this from 1 to 2 here, you'll see that I now immediately have 8 samples, which is saying E prime is going to cycle through all 4 of these exemplars twice. And it just grows exponentially. So I have there, that was 8. If I put 3, it's 12, and then 4 is 16, obviously, just because, you know, multiples of 4. So I'm just going to keep this at 2, though. And you have this option here to reset sampling at the beginning of each run. That just means every time E prime runs this list, am I resetting all of the objects that I've run in it? I don't necessarily care about that. But I do want to hop over to this selection tab now, and it says no repeat after. This is a really important property because what's going to happen, and I want to set this to yes, because since I have 2 cycles here, what E prime is going to do is it's going to randomly select, you know, all of these objects. Then it's going to recycle through the list and reselect them again. If I don't have this reset, no repeat after, set to yes, what may happen is participants might get the word cat as the last exemplar in this cycle and as the first one in the next cycle. So what it's going to look like is the word cat just appears twice, and it's going to look like E prime like stuttered a little bit, and that's not ideal. So if I do change this no repeat to yes, it's going to make sure that the last item of one cycle is not the same as the first item of the next cycle, so there's no chance of E prime immediately repeating any of these. I'm going to go ahead and click OK to save all of those changes, and that's all I need to do on this object. So I'm going to close out all my windows. They are just tabs at the top here. I can go ahead and click through them if I want, but I don't necessarily want that, so I'm going to click Close All and click on my trial proc. Now, if you remember the instructions, the first thing I said we were going to add is a fixation. So let's go ahead and add a fixation object. What we've been adding so far to the experiment is a lot of slide objects. Welcome and instructions are slides, and we've been working a lot with list objects and procedure objects. We don't really need that right now. All we're going to do is just show a simple plus sign in the middle of the screen. So I'm going to take a text display object and make it the first item in my trial proc here. I'm going to rename it from text display 1 to fixation. And I'm going to double click on it to open it in eStudio's workspace. Whoops. Now, all I need to do to actually make a plus sign in the middle of the screen is just press the plus button. Now, if you're new to E prime, know what you're thinking. This looks like the top of the screen, and it does. But if I take a look at this properties page here, you'll see that my align vertical and align horizontal property are currently set to center. These two properties dictate where the text and where the items, or not items, just text actually, where the text in this text display object appear at runtime. Right now it's set to center, so I know that this fixation object isn't going to appear at the top of the screen when I run this. It's actually going to show up in the center. However, if I do want it to show up on the top here and I want it to look like exactly what it looks like on here, I would change this align vertical property to top. And if I hit apply, you'll see that there's no change, unlike the slide object that like kind of changes right away. There's no change to this property at all, or to this the location of this cross here, or this little plus sign. But if I change it to center, again, no change, but during runtime it's going to show up in the middle of the screen. Again, that's what I want, so I'm going to keep it right there. As far as duration input's concerned, 1000 milliseconds seems completely fine, but I do want to change data logging from none to time audit only, just so I do have some data on this fixation object. This is going to tell me if there were any delays in presenting this and how long those delays were if there were delays. So I'm going to click apply and OK to save this change here. And that's all I need to do. My fixation is created. So I'm going to hop back into my trial proc and I'm going to make another slide object and put it just after fixation. Now this one, just to keep in line with the naming scheme, is just going to be called stimulus. Now if you'll note, this the name of this object is the exact same name as my attribute here. That shouldn't be a problem. Generally speaking, I like to name everything differently, so I am going to deviate from the sample a little bit here. I'm just going to call this one stim display instead. Again, if you're following along at home and you want something that looks exactly like the sample, keep that name stimulus. Otherwise, it's completely fine to change it to stim display. It's not going to change its functionality at all. So I'm going to double click on my stim display to open it in the workspace here. And I want to add a couple of text display objects to this. Now the first one is just going to be a little small and up in the top left-hand corner here. I want to resize that. And all this is going to be is just a very simple question. Just, is this a word? Oops, I spelled word right. There we go. Is this a word? And that's all that I need in that top left corner. I'm going to resize that a little bit because it seems a little big for there. There we go. Now I'm going to add one more text display object, and this is what's actually going to reference that try list that I had made. So if you look at my try list, I have this stim type property right here. The stimulus property right here, and it's going to show either dog, cat, or my two non-words. And I want those words that I have on my list object to show up here, and I want them to change trial by trial. I want each one of them to show up in here. To do that, I'm going to delete the text that's on here, and I'm just going to click on the left square bracket on my keyboard and see what happens. Immediately, you see something called a trip sense, and you see a little feature name right there. It's pretty nice. So a trip sense just says, hey, these are all the attributes in your experiment. Which one are you trying to reference? I'm trying to reference my stimulus attribute that I had made in my trial list. If you look here, it even says stimulus is defined in trial list, a list item. It just lets you know what trial list is, saying list item. The only different ones are this session here and the subject. Subject is defined in startup info, so whenever I ran the experiment, you saw that asked me for my session number and my subject number. I can reference those at any point in the experiment through an attribute reference like this, and it lets you know where it's being set, in this case startup. And data file is data.base name is another default that we add to this. It just lets you know the name of the data file that you're creating. But all I need here is stimulus, so what I'm going to do is just click on it once. As you can see, it now has the name of my attribute in these little square brackets. Now that's a signaling E prime to say, hey, I'm not actually going to show the word stimulus whenever this appears on the screen. I'm actually going to show whatever's under that stimulus column. So it's going to show whatever is here. So it's going to show cat, dog, and my two non-words. Now I have my fixation object in the center of the screen, and it's a smart idea to have this in the center of the screen as well, right where the fixation object is, especially if you have a fixation object. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to change the properties of this slide text sub-object by clicking on the properties page icon there and going to the frame tab, and I was aiming for 50%, 50%, and I'm 2% off in each direction, at least I'm consistent. So I will change the X value to center, and I will change the Y value to center. And if I click apply, you'll see that kind of snap into place. Boom. And then click OK. So that's all I need to do to make that. And now I need to add two buttons. I'm going to add a button off to the left here. Resize this one a little bit. And this one is going to be my yes button. So I'm going to rename this one. I'm just going to go on the properties page to do this. I'm going to rename this one to yes button. Now, if I look here, it says responses reported by the slide button shall report yes button for the rest property. Now, if you think back to my trial list, I have a correct response, and the correct response is actually the word word. So that's what I'm going to want to put in my response here. So if I put word in my response, it's now going to say responses reported by the slide button shall report word for the response property. And if you remember right, this is exactly how I formatted my word and non-word. If I hop back to my trial list, it now looks exactly like this object. So that's exactly what I'm going to need there. I need to go back into the properties page here, and the only thing I need to change then is the text on it again, and I need to change this to yes. Now, what I want to do is I want to make a no button, but I want it to make it the exact same size as this button. And that can be a little tricky sometimes, especially if you don't know how big this is, and you just kind of like, did the drag and drop method with these corners here like I did to resize the button. So I want to make it identical. Now what I could do is I can hop into the properties page here, click on the frame tab, say, okay, width is 32%, height is 14%. I could also just highlight it, copy and paste it. So what I did was I highlighted it, hit Control-C on my keyboard, and then pasted it by clicking Control-V. And what that did is it made an identical version of the button. As you can see here, it's named button 1, while this one's called yes button. So I'm going to change this one from button 1 to no button. Just in the properties page there, the name is now no button. Oops, there we go. And my response for this one isn't going to be word, it's going to be non-word. Because if participants are pressing no, they're saying, hey, this is a non-word. So I'll click apply and OK. And if you see here, the last thing I need to change is the text on it, because right now I have 2 yeses, and that's not ideal. So I'll go over to my theme tab, click on text, and I will change my text from yes to no. And then click apply and OK. So now I have my yes button set up and my no button set up. Now the only thing I need to do is I need to change the duration, or the properties page here, specifically the duration input tab. So I want this to appear on the screen for 3,000 milliseconds. So I'm just going to go ahead and type 3,000 into here. Data logging is of course going to be standard because this is the critical part of my task. I want to log how long it took, I want to log the reaction time, and I want to log what they pressed. So I'm going to click apply just to save these changes quickly. Now I'm going to add a button input mask, and this is where things get a little different. Now in the previous ones, or the previous input masks that I added, I had this little asterisk character, or this wildcard character. This just means that any press is allowable. Now let's say I want to restrict that. Let's say I have a lot of buttons on the screen, and I only want to restrict my responses to 2 of them. What I'm going to do is I'm going to just put word here as my 1 button, and if I wanted to, I could also put afterwards, I could put non-word, like this. But E' has a bit of a shortcut when you're dealing with button objects. And if I get rid of these 2 curly brackets in the middle, and instead just put a pipe character, just like that. It's found just over my enter button on the keyboard. If I put a pipe character in between there, E' is going to automatically know that this is 2 separate buttons, and that responses to these 2 buttons are part of my allowable. So it's just a fun little trick when you're using button objects. Now my correct response, I'm going to change this one to stim type, because participants will be pressing either word or non-word, so my correct is going to line up with either the word or non-word whenever they press it. And I'm just going to go ahead and click apply and OK. And now my slide object's all set up. So the last thing I want to add to my trial proc here is a feedback display object. I want participants to know if they've responded correctly or incorrectly to these buttons. And for troubleshooting purposes, it's also going to make sure that I'm setting the experiment up correctly, because it's very obvious to me what a word and a non-word is, especially considering I'm the one that made this chart up. So if, let's say, I end up clicking on yes, this is a word, and it's not a word, and my feedback says, no, you're wrong, then I know that it's actually acting correctly. Or if, the word cat appears, I click yes, it's a word, and my feedback says you're wrong, then it's clearly not working right. So even if you're not necessarily showing feedback to your participants, if you want to check the accuracy and that the logic, or the internal logic of your accuracy is correct, the feedback objects help for troubleshooting in that way. So we'll take a feedback object and put it just after stim display here, and I'm just going to rename this one to feedback, just to maintain consistency between the sample and what I have here. Now, as far as this feedback is concerned, it looks great to me. I have the word correct if I get it right, I have the word incorrect if I get it wrong, and I am going to show my mean my reaction time to this object and my mean accuracy. So overall, what percentage have I gotten correct? These are called feedback macros. So this @rt and @acc.mean, it's just a simple macro that we already have on these feedback display objects that let you know the reaction time and the accuracy, or the mean accuracy of a particular object in E'. Right now it's not pointing at a particular object, so we need to tell it to do that. So I'm going to click on the properties page icon right here, and then I'm just going to change this input object name property. It's just my way of saying, E', look at my stim display, I want you to judge my accuracy on that. So I'll click on this drop down arrow, click on stim display, and click apply and OK. That's all I need to change. Its default duration is 1,500 milliseconds. I think that's completely fine. I'm just going to change data logging to time audit only, just for the sake of having some data on my feedback object. And that's really all I need. Now, theoretically, I could finish the experiment here and be like, okay, I'm done. But I want a goodbye object. I just want something saying, hey, thanks for participation, goodbye. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to make a text display object, put it at the end of my block list, And the reason I'm putting it at the end of my block list and not after my feedback object, even though technically it will come after a feedback object, is if I put it at the end of my trial proc here and put it right after feedback, it's going to tell the participants goodbye after every single stimuli. And participants are going to think, oh, the experiment's over, and it won't be over. And they'll think, oh, it's over now, and it's not over. So I put it here at the very end of my session proc. Whoops. I put it at the very end of my session proc here. That way I can guarantee it is the very last thing that's shown whenever E prime quits the experiment. So I'm going to rename this by clicking on rename. Oops. There we go. Rename it goodbye. And just type a very simple message. There we go. Thank you very much for your participation. Have a great day. That's all I really need there. Alright, so now that I have everything all set up, I'm going to go ahead and run it quick. And I'm going to run it in my windowed mode here. And I'm going to test it, and I'm going to take my time through the first couple of exemplars just to make sure that it's working exactly correctly. So for my previous runs, I know that my instruction, or my welcome screen here, and my instruction screens are going to work perfectly. And it looks like they do. So there's my fixation. It says, is this a word? It is my non-word, so I'm going to click no. No response detected because it timed out. Is this a word dog? Dog is yes. I was correct. That is not a word. Also correct. So let's get some incorrect now. Cat. I'm going to click no. Looks like my feedback's working correctly. And that's not a word, so that's perfect. So it looks like everything's working great there. So I'm just going to go ahead and respond to these last couple. Not a word. That is a word. And there's my goodbye slide, or text display object. Perfect. So it looks like everything is working exactly correctly. So let's go ahead and hop into the data file there just to see what everything looks like. So if I go ahead and look at my output window here, it's going to show me where that data file is saved. This is a nice little shortcut in ePrime. You can see that I have two files here. I have an experiment advisor report, and I have this E.3 file. If I go ahead and open up that experiment advisor report, what it's going to do is it's going to tell me some statistics about my run, and I'll just open that up in Internet Explorer quickly. So it's going to tell me some information about my run that isn't necessarily found in Microsoft Explorer. It's me later. Okay. Go away. There we go. So what this is going to do is it's going to show me some basic information about my run that isn't necessarily found in my EDAT file. So experiment name, button RT, what time did I run it? I ran it at 11:10. What was my subject session, and how long did it take me? It took me 36 seconds to run this experiment. So some pretty helpful information. But then it also goes on to what we call experiment advisor findings. So are there any issues in my experiment that might impact the timing of it? Right here, duration not divisible by refresh rate. And if I click on this little button here, it's going to take me to a page that tells me all about this experiment advisor finding. It seems to be taking a second to load, so I'm just going to go back. But what the message is, it says the fixation object has an onset sync property set to vertical blank and a duration value of 1000 that's not divisible by my calculated refresh rate. So my calculated refresh rate right now is 16 Hertz, which means at about every 16.64 milliseconds, my screen is going to change. And of course, 1000 isn't immediately divisible by that without any remainders. So it's going to suggest a low and a high duration for me. So I should change my duration to be either 998 or 1015 milliseconds to be divisible by this refresh rate. That way I don't have any onset delays whenever I'm showing my fixation object. And the point of all of these timings is literally just, for all of these timing experiment advisor findings, is just to eliminate what we call .onset delay in ePrime. And what onset delay in ePrime is just the difference between when the object was supposed to run and when it actually ran. And any onset delay is basically a pause in your experiment or a delay in your experiment. And I'll show you those in the EDAT file in a second, but these are just to eliminate those. So this tells you what your experiment advisor found, and it even recommends some fixes. So I like to think of it as kind of frontline tech support. My list of experiment advisor modules here are just everything that ePrime was checking for. So you can pretty much skip this if you didn't have any findings. Clock info, so what clock was I using? And then device info, so this tells me about my devices it ran. So I have a display device, This is what the resolution was when I ran it. This was the color bit depth. This was my calculated refresh rate, so 60.1. And then was flipping enabled. This tells me about my keyboard, mouse, sound. And then this is another great one too, is this list of running applications. So if you ever find that ePrime either like crashes in the middle of a run, or it says display too busy, that's a pretty common error that you get, or if you find that it's kind of running slowly for whatever reason, this list of running applications is a really good place to check, because what it'll do is it will show you specifically what size or how big each program is and how much of your memory it's taking. So I have a lot of stuff open right now. So I had eStudio, for example. I have Google Chrome. I have a couple of those things, and it tells you exactly how big that was and when it was open and how much space it took. So it's pretty helpful, especially if you're trying to diagnose any errors in ePrime that might be related to another background program. So we do recommend checking that. So after checking the experiment advisor, because it is important, let's hop into our data file here. Now let's take a look here. There's my welcome screen. We've already looked at that. Now if you look here, my welcome.rt value is repeated over and over and over again for every single item in my data file. This doesn't mean that I always responded to the exact, down to the millisecond to this object 8 times. Welcome only happened once. And if you see here, all of the data is repeated for all of that. And the reason it's repeated is because there are other columns here, and it's just not going to say nothing. So it's just saying, hey, my welcome RT was this. The only time it was relevant was right here. But if you need to reference it during any other level, just know that that was your welcome RT. However, if I go over to my stim display, this is going to be the data that's a little more relevant. Now, if you notice I'm doing a lot of scrolling here, if you know what the relevant data is going to be, it's important, or that it's easy to just go to this Arrange Columns button here, click Remove All, and then I'm just going to type stim display and hit Enter. And if you see, it highlights everything relating to stim display. So I'm going to go ahead and add that and click OK. And now my data file looks a little more manageable. So if I look here, there's that onset delay column that I was talking about. And it's reporting -1s and -2s. Now those are great values, because it means that instead of this object going on the screen a little later than it should have been, it came on the screen a little sooner than it should have been by either 1 or 2 milliseconds, which is actually phenomenal timing. So I like this, I like the way it's looking. I know my experiment didn't have many delays associated with it. Now if I look here, at this very first row here, you're going to see that I didn't respond to that one. That was my no response. That's why my stim display onset time was set to 3,129 milliseconds, which means that it just sat there for 3,000 milliseconds and did nothing. And then for all of these, I actually responded, and that's why you don't see an RT and an RT time in this first column, but you see them here. Now, if you're newer to ePrime, one of the easiest things to mix up is the difference between RT and RT time, because they both report very different looking numbers. These look much bigger than these do. What the RT value is the difference between when the object appeared on the screen and when the participant responded to it. We generally find that this is the most useful metric. So if you want to get simple reaction time from a participant, RT is exactly what you're looking for. RT time is the difference between when I clicked run on the experiment and when I pressed the button. So in this case, exactly 21,453 milliseconds passed from when I clicked run to when I clicked on the yes button during my second trial. Or, more appropriately, or a little more useful for my case, I took exactly 1,549 milliseconds to see the image, read it, and respond to it. And then you can see everything that I clicked here, so word and non-word. And then if you look over here, you can see where I was correct. So accuracy, a 0 indicates incorrect, a 1 indicates correct. You can see what my correct response should have been. You can see what I did, or with what device I responded to this object, so I responded using the button device. So these are some pretty good looking data. So this is the data that you're mostly going to need. If you want to calculate anything, so you want to do some preliminary descriptive statistics, click on this Analyze button here. And I am just going to look at accuracy and reaction time. So .acc is my accuracy, RT is my reaction time. And I'm going to look at the mean, but I'm also going to add a standard deviation here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to drag this RT twice, and I'm going to look at my mean. But if I double click on it, you can see that I can summarize it by something different. And I'll just do standard deviation here. And then my columns are going to be by stim type. So am I responding to words or non-words more accurately and faster? So I'm going to click Run. My accuracy, it looks like I'm able to identify words a little better than I am my non-words. It looks like my reaction time, though, was much higher to words than non-words, and my standard deviation, I had far more standard deviation whenever I had a non-word on the screen. Now, if I want to take this and bring it to another program, I have the option to just click Excel copy, and it'll open this data up in Excel. If I do StatView or SPSS, I have the options of making a table. So there are a lot of different options for viewing your data and for exporting the data once it's in ePrime. And I can even click on this export, click the program that I want to export it to, so either Excel or StatView SPSS. Click OK, and it's going to make this other file. And this other file that it makes is going to be able to be opened by StatView and SPSS. It doesn't actually open it for you, just because it changes relatively frequently. We like to make it as consistent as possible, so it'll just make a different kind of file that you can open up in StatView and in SPSS. Alright, well, that is all the information I have for the live stream today. If you have absolutely any questions at all, feel free to go to support.psdnet.com and go ahead and click on Submit a Ticket. I'd be happy to answer questions about this live stream or anything else that you've seen, or if you're running into problems with your own ePrime experiments or would like a little more advice on making one, feel free to leave us a question. If you have any specific questions about this live stream at all, or if you have recommendations for future live streams, please leave a comment on it, on this video. I'm more than happy to kind of shape these how you guys want them. And as always, feel free to like and subscribe to our page. It definitely helps us to continue doing what we do. So thank you guys very much, and have a great day.